Hello everybody, my name is Dojalix and welcome to the Countertop, the video series that covers VeggieTales theories, questions, and all things logical within the world of VeggieTales. This is brought to you by Mediocre Concept. Today, we are going to begin our series where we're going to cover the true origin story of everyone's favorite plunger-headed superhero, Larryboy. Now, we all know the first ever Larryboy episode that was ever aired, Larryboy and the Fit from Outer Space. However, within the series, there was no true explanation to how the Cucumber of Steel truly came to be. How did Larry the Cucumber become Larryboy? And I believe that this is something that is actually explained throughout the series. And it's something that is explained throughout the entire series when you read between the lines and really take a look at every single aspect of many of the different videos within VeggieTales. This is all taking place previous to the Netflix era, as well as it will include some aspects of the VeggieTales show, because it is shown in the VeggieTales show that there is continuity from Beauty and the Beat to whatever the first, I think it's the Peace episode, I can't remember what it's called, in the VeggieTales show. I'm sure Slade will throw that up there so that way you will see what the first ever VeggieTales show episode actually is. But yeah, anyways, you see that there is a continuity, and they confirm that those two shows combined, the Netflix era is its own separate thing, VeggieTales multiverse. I won't get into that. That'll be another theory for another video. Okay, cool. All right, so without further ado, grab your popcorn, turn down the lights, and get ready for the origin of Larryboy. Now, one thing that you're going to need to know in this theory is we are not including direct Bible stories, such as Daniel in the Lion's Den, Esther, Little Joe, Moe and the Big Exit, etc. This is because they are biblical truths, and we at Mediocre Concept are not going to twist the stories and the biblical truths, no matter how funny or how well it fits, to fit our fan theories. This is scripture, not fan theory. All right. So before we go in to the origin story of Larryboy, we need to go and cover everything that we know about our plunger-headed hero. His abilities are not as important as the details about the character himself, but we're still going to give just a brief overview of Larryboy and his most important ability, and that is his plunger ears, or super suction ears, whatever you want to call them. As we know, Larryboy's one of his key abilities is the fact that he uses those toilet plungers as ears to do various different things between swinging around Bumbleberg as well as giving himself positional advantages and to grab items and all of that different stuff. You've seen it a lot, and so it's important to know that that is a key part to his ability, and it is important for our theory, and we will explain it as we get deeper in. So let's go over some things about that we know about Larryboy, as it will help us to unlock the key to his origin. We know that Larryboy is a superhero in the city of Bumbleberg. This is something that is covered very early on in the mainstream VeggieTales series in Larryboy and the Fib from Outer Space. This is also confirmed through a later episode in the VeggieTales show that the VeggieTales show is filmed within the city of Bumbleberg, whether it be in Mr. Nez's theater or the actual studio itself where they had the countertop and QWERTY and everything. That was all filmed within the city of Bumbleberg. So we can be certain that this all holds together whenever they mention Bumbleberg within the show. We know that it's a real place, and it's not something the Veggies made up to film Larryboy. Now, one thing we can also confirm is that Larryboy does operate out of a mansion and a Larry cave, each of these having distinct shots throughout various VeggieTales episodes that show Larry's mansion. Now that we have a basic understanding of our hero's layout and who he is and where he is, we can move on. The next thing we're going to take a look at is the cucumber behind the mask, Larry the Cucumber. Larry the Cucumber is a co-founder and a co-host of the very popular series VeggieTales. We know that he spends his days helping teach kids about God through various stories and silly songs aside his best friend Bob the Tomato. Now, at this point, I'm pretty sure I can guess what you're thinking. But Zojalix wasn't he a janitor in the Daily Bumble in the Cartoon Adventures, you silly goose? Oh, you are such small brain. We have bigger brain than you. We know that he was a janitor, not a host. This is all just a fraud. We are big brain. You are little brain. No. Stop. Okay? We will cover all of that in a future video. Don't get your shorts in a knot. The Cartoon Adventures of Larryboy is something important within the VeggieTales canon, but it is not something that we are going to be discussing this early on in the video. Okay, I'm just shutting that down right now before you guys try and use that to debunk anything that I am bringing to you guys in this video today. All right, cool. The next thing we are going to be talking about is Larryboy's faithful butler, Alfred. We know that he is a dedicated mentor and friend to Larry. This friendship takes an even different form when we look at his character. His character is significantly more complex than the series would lead you to believe. He's more than just your butler and mentor. There's actually quite a bit of depth there that it will be covered throughout this series. Obviously, as you're living your life as a superhero, you have a secret identity. Okay? Now, we do know that Larry is not the smartest knife in the drawer. So this is why he has his faithful butler, Alfred. And this is where Alfred really comes in. Alfred, or as we know and kind of love him, kind of don't, Archibald Asparagus. That's right, our lovable butler is the critical, rash, and very passionate Archibald Asparagus. How can this be possible if Archibald Asparagus doesn't like Larry, and Larry isn't the biggest fan of Archibald Asparagus, but yet they're solid friends here? Like, obviously, you know Archibald plays the character of Alfred within the show. But I think it's more than just he plays a character, but rather Alfred is himself. Archibald is the character that he holds. Let me explain. Alfred is a dedicated butler. He understands that Larry is not the smartest knife in the drawer. Therefore, he steps in. He steps in a lot of ways. In order to help his dear friend to not reveal his identity, Alfred then becomes an early member of the cast and crew of VeggieTales. He could very easily have been the first one to volunteer his services when the pitch was happening. He comes in as a snotty man who is constantly critiquing everything going on within the show and is trying to make sure that it is a proper way to demonstrate Bible lessons and we aren't getting very over excessive with all these silly songs and other rash actions. And throughout this, he creates this relationship with Larry the Cucumber to be a very, very tense one, where they're constantly going back and forth about what is the proper way that the show should continue. But this is all just a way for Alfred to be able to help Larry maintain his cover as Larryboy, as well as maintain his own cover. Because when you think about it, Larry is Larry the Cucumber, okay? Not really the smartest person not the smartest person out there. I've said that a few times. But then through him not being the smartest person out there, we now have Larry the Cucumber setting up as this supposed extraordinarily wealthy person. That doesn't make sense. How can Larry the Cucumber be so wealthy that he lives in a mansion and has a lot of money? And has a butler? Larry should not have a butler. Hence why Alfred becomes Archibald and not Alfred. That way, no suspicion is ever placed on Larry that there's anything else going on other than just him living out his job as Larry the Cucumber and then going out the rest of his day. So that is where we're going to be setting up sort of the modern day setting, the placement of, I don't know, the beginning of the theory, because this is all where it begins, where we're taking what we know. And now that we have these things that we know, we're going to start piecing together where this all came together, how this all fits, where does it start, where does it end, where does it really truly fit within this series of VeggieTales.
So the world needs now is a hero, one who's kind and true and brave and...
So now, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be winding back the clock quite a bit of time. We're going to be going all the way back to the origin of the family tree of Larry and how through all of the events that are recorded within the show of VeggieTales, we're seeing the birth of Larryboy and the inspiration from that as something way, way, way back that happened in ancient time. And yes, ancient times sounds like a crazy amount. You're probably like, oh, this first socialists, you're coming up with this theory that goes back to ancient times. There's bound to be ways that it falls apart. And I'm going to be honest, there actually are. But that is just because we don't have necessary information because information gets lost over time. That's history. That's an important part of history. But for the majority of this, it's going to be fairly accurate to the information that is provided within the show. So, we're going to go ahead and we're going to rewind the clock. The year is 1096. Yes, 1096, believe it or not. The Roman Empire during this time has become one of the largest world powers and are now in a state of war. This war is with the dangerous, the deadly, and the cunning barbarians. Now, this is not obviously where the mantle of Larryboy begins. I explained that earlier on. So, but bear with me here. The seeds that sprout into what we see as Larryboy begins is in the video Mac Larry and the Stinky Cheese battle. That's right. This is the first time that Larry's lineage is ever shown on screen in the year of 1096. And the reason this is the year of the 1096 is because this is around the time when the Crusades began. And this is going to be an important aspect for the beginning of the Crusades in the year 1096, as we then fast forward periodically even more throughout the history of the Roman Empire and where it all continues on in the history of VeggieTales to what we then lead up to as the mantle of Larryboy coming in modern day times. So, we're going to be focusing on three very distinct characters in this video. We have Mac Larry himself, which is the patriarch here. Well, not quite the patriarch, but at this point, one of the key factors of this lineage. We have the father of Mac Larry, the great barbarian Chognorius. That is something that is very important, and we're going to have to be watching that because that will give us an insight. Well, it'll just give us an insight as to how Larry becomes who he is when you combine the aspects of both Chognorius and Mac Larry. Okay, but we'll get to that again in a second. And then we have the great inventor Archimedes. Now, Archimedes, we'll explain that later as he becomes more relevant within the video itself. So, the barbarians have been in a prank war with the Romans during this time. Their pranks range from bad haircuts to water balloon attacks. And there's only one thing that Chog wants more than to see the destruction of the Romans. And that is for his son, Mac Larry, to become a fully dedicated barbarian prankster. However, this doesn't go as planned. And it definitely does not go as well as Chog would have hoped. As part of the barbarian ritual, you have to take this exam before you are a fully indoctrinated barbarian prankster. And in this instance, Mac Larry was around that age where he would be taking this exam. But the struggle with Mac Larry is he fails the exam multiple times. Attempt after attempt after attempt, Mac Larry was unable to pass his exam to go on raids. But this was because Mac Larry was not a prankster. He was a soon-to-be inventor. He was the biggest fan of the most legendary inventor at the time, Archimedes. And all he wanted to do was to meet him and to become his apprentice so that he could learn how to become an even better inventor. This is important. Now, since Mac Larry failed his prankster exam, he decided it was time to move on. He was going to leave his home, and he was going to then become the apprentice of Archimedes. He was just going to put pranking behind him, and Archimedes was going to be his focus. Now, long story short, Mac Larry got deceived. There was some really stinky cheese. I believe it's called
The Cheese of Attila.
And eventually, Archimedes does show up at the end. Now, pay attention to Archimedes here. Look at who Archimedes has a very, very strong resemblance to. And obviously you would be thinking, well, duh, it's the show. Of course it's going to be played Archimedes, Archibald Godoy. Well, yes, but also that family relationship that we covered in the last video is really important. It's important that you understand that that family relationship between Larry and Archie Archibald or Alfred has to start somewhere. And this is where it starts. In the tutelage between Archimedes and Mac Larry. Okay? And also, look at the monocle. Look at the monocle. So that's really all that we're going to be getting into in Mac Larry and the Stinky Cheese battle. We're seeing now the lineage beginning here. We are seeing the cleverness of Chognorius being shown in his son Mac Larry, then being, or in Chognorius in his pranking, and then being passed down to his son Mac Larry, and Mac Larry using his cleverness in his own way to become an inventor. And if you have more questions about that, watch the Mac Larry video. That just solves a lot of the issues there. Anyways, as Mac Larry continues his tutelage with Archimedes, this is going to be taking place then after the events of Mac Larry and the Stinky Cheese battle. He begins to adopt some of the lifestyle of the Romans. He learns about living proper and the difference between being a barbarian and a Roman and how there had a lot of cultural differences in that aspect. So, with these cultural differences, this then leads us into our next film, which would take place around the time of the Second Crusade specifically. And this would be Robin Hood and his not-so-merry men. All right? Now, in this episode, we have Robin Hood, a descendant of Mac Larry. Now, obviously, you're like, but his last name is Norrius. How does he get the last name Good? Okay, yeah, well, you know, people have daughters. Whoa. Yeah. So anyway, Robin Hood spends his time in Sherwood Forest, fundraising from the rich to give to the poor, because during this time, Sherwood Forest is in a state of poverty. And if you look at his roster of not-so-merry men, there's one distinct person that sticks out. Friar Cluck. Yes, that's all that's relevant. He's there. That family relationship continues. And the fact that the descendants of Archimedes be a member of the church, it's not that surprising, to be honest. Unfortunately, right now, one of the biggest treasures within Sherwood Forest is a ham. They love ham. Like, instead of a birthday cake, you get a birthday ham. But unfortunately, Prince John has established this tax that makes hams extraordinarily expensive. And he starts kind of hoarding all of the ham that is in Sherwood Forest. And yeah, it's not pretty. Anyway, long story short, eventually the giants that really, really, really want ham end up coming in and causing some struggle, which then Robin Hood goes and messes some things up. And, well, when I say messes some things up, I mean he fixes the giant issue. And then eventually at the end, the people are deciding who they should put in charge, and they want to put Robin Hood in charge, but Robin Hood is like, no, that's not for me. You should really be putting, and he points to the sheriff and puts him in charge. To which then the sheriff, who is played by Bob the Tomato, ends up being in charge. And this is a key point here as well. So, throughout this time, now, between the crusade that we're at here to then the next period, we've got another period of time where Robin Hood and his lineage would continue to build up the line in Sherwood Forest. They would continue to ascend, and it would become another great kingdom. In fact, it would become a kingdom so great that eventually, by the time the Roman Empire splits apart, you have its kingdom. And this becomes the kingdom of Scone. Yes, the kingdom of Scone. I'm sure that sounds familiar. But we aren't going to be covering that in this video because we're actually kind of starting to run low on time.
It's complicated. I'll explain later.
But anyways, Robin Hood would move on eventually within his lineage to now he would jump ahead and he would be the one leading versus the line of the sheriff. They would kind of sink below because everybody held this high esteem of Robin Hood and they were like, oh my gosh, we love Robin Hood. He's doing all the things. And so eventually that lineage just eventually trumps the lineage of the sheriff. And now, as we get to the Third Crusade, we're going, well, the eve of the Third Crusade, I would say. We're kind of like quite a few years out of that yet still. But we're going to be entering our very next period of time where the lineage of Robin Hood ascends into power and you get the man, the myth, the knight, the legend, Duke.
So the world needs now is a hero, one who's kind and true and brave and bold.
It kinda is later.
Oui. Let's go to the book. Page!
So in the events of Duke and the Great Pie War, we are introduced to Duke. He is a knight of the Kingdom of Scone. We don't actually know Duke's last name. That's something that is not talked about in the episode itself. But we do know that Duke is a knight of the Kingdom of Scone, which probably after some rolling around of kingdoms and stuff within the world due to wars and different stuff like that, we are looking at then Scone, which is probably some sort of descendant of the kingdom in Sherwood Forest that was talked about in Robin Hood and His Not So Merry Men. So Duke is we're just going to call him now Duke. This is where kind of the timeline gets a little funky because it's a little bit after Robin Hood, but still quite a bit before where we actually get to where the mantle of Larryboy begins. Somewhere in this time, it is important that we know that there is a break in the family line from which we talked about with Archimedes, talked about in Mac Larry and the Stinky Cheese Battle, and where we get Archibald. Now, this is where the information kind of gets lost because obviously they haven't done everything in history and we are just lacking some of that information. Anyway, so now we have Duke, and then we have Lucas, Duke's little compatriot person, which we know is Bob, who would be a descendant from the sheriff. I don't actually remember his real name. I just know it's Sheriff Mediocre. I just refer to him as Sheriff Mediocre because that scene was absolutely hilarious. So we have the descendant of the sheriff, and then that is Lucas, becomes his good friend after all of the events of Robin Hood and His Not So Merry Men. And this actually is where we'll get into the character of Thingamabob because it will then create another family relationship, but that we will talk about Thingamabob as we get more into the modern day era of Larryboy, probably in some future video. Anyway, Duke is going through his life trying to become a knight, and he's failing epically at it. It's not pretty. But anyway, on his way after night school, he runs into and is introduced to the wonderful
Sweet, sweet Petunia.
And this is where things get a little complicated. So, Petunia was a princess in the kingdom of Rhubarb, got married to the son of Gildersleeve the Invincible, which is Ryan the Not So Invincible. And then the Great Pie War begins between the Kingdom of Scone and the Rhubarbarians, Petunia being a princess of Rhubarb, Ryan being a very influential member in the Kingdom of Scone, possibly even the Prince of Scone. Well, they go to war. Ryan and Gildersleeve the Invincible get pied because apparently they're not actually invincible. It's not Ryan the not invincible, it is Ryan the less... Ryan the...
Fine, I'll do it myself.
Ryan, the only slightly less invincible. Oh!
Ryan and Gildersleeve are now killed in war, which leaves Nona as a widow and Petunia also as a widow. And Petunia still has the opportunity to live in her life of royalty in the Kingdom of Rhubarb, but she decides to forsake her life of royalty in order to take care of her mother-in-law, Nona. There's actually kind of a pretty strong parallel to the Book of Ruth there. Didn't actually think about it, but there it is. Haha, biblical truth. Anyway, so they go and they're living extraordinarily poor in the Kingdom of Scone, to which then Duke comes along and is asked to joust for Nona and Petunia in order to help them to survive. Duke then offers to joust, and he understands that he has to joust against Gildersleeve's brother, which is the wonderful man Otis the Elevated. And after a very... So, they go to joust. After a very... I don't want to say the word intense.
Whoa! 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 Whoa!
Because it was more awkward. But after a dazzling...
Wait, you want to know who's on first?
Correct. Next.
What?
Absolutely correct. And third?
I don't know.
Correct.
Wait, who went third?
Wrong.
Well, not really dazzling either. It... Well, they joust. And after they joust, Otis the Elevated is defeated and Duke wins, thus getting the key to Gildersleeve's castle, as well as the key to the vault. And then he takes his wonderful bride, Petunia, in marriage, and they live happily ever after, the end. So now, Duke has ascended to even more power within this kingdom here. He just a lot of power. And so now then Duke is living as the king of Scone with Petunia, his wonderful bride, as the queen. And then eventually they have a child, because that's what you do when you get married. You have children, and their child is now the less slightly incredible, but yet still very notable King George, which is where we move on to our next video, King George and the Ducky. Which King George and the Ducky only really is just a way to continue the timeline. There's not really any real key events in there that really happen. You know the story of King George and the Ducky. George has a very unhealthy obsession with his duck. He spots Thomas having fun with his duck in the bath, and then after that hole, he sees the duck and is like,
I must have it, I must get it, you must go and get it for me.
and then, well, he sneaks off wearing a terrible disguise, steals the duck, sends Thomas out into battle because the Great Pie War is still happening. The Pie War then concludes with Thomas getting creamed, but he survives after an intense battle with Shell Shock and a nice, wonderful bath in King George's bath. Thomas then gets his senses, which is then also where we are introduced to the character of Ricochet. Again, more information there we will then dive into as we get deeper on into the modern day areas of the League of Incredible Vegetables and what we see in the current state of VeggieTales today. But again, that will be covered in later videos. So anyway, after King George realizes that he is a terrible person and he literally tried to get Thomas murdered all in the name of a duck, he asks Thomas to forgive him. Thomas says, sure fam, you tried to kill me, but it's alright, you're my pal and I will forgive you because that's what heroes do. And then they sing a song about selfishness, and then you fade out after a wonderful medley of
Wait a minute. No, it weren't. Wasn't. It should be.
So the world needs now is a hero, one who's kind and true and brave and
we are going to now be jumping forward a couple hundred years and going into a slightly more modernized era in which we can see the mantle of Larryboy fully being developed. Not just the mantle of Larryboy, though, but also the mantle of the entirety of the League of Incredible Vegetables. I apologize for my camera focus kind of wigging in and out. I don't know exactly what causes that. I think it might be my glasses, honestly. But anyway, without further ado, let's dive into today's episode and show you where exactly the mantle of Larryboy truly begins. The time period now is that we're going to be looking for is you actually see this example within the footage of, kind of see the beginning of this example within the show VeggieTales Larryboy and the Bad Apple. So basically it's in that one scene when Alfred is like, I need to go to the VeggieTales Historical Society to be able to figure out more information about the webs and what's necessarily been going on there. So he goes to the library, and as he's in the library, he starts doing some research, and he finds this film of the founding of Bumbleberg, to which you see basically a rendition of the Pilgrims coming over from the from Europe over to then start Bumbleberg on a ship known as the Cauliflower. And so basically what happens, they come over on the Cauliflower, and you have now the founder of Bumbleberg, Obadiah Bumbley. Once you've now got Obadiah Bumbley in the scene, you can then, this is Larry's ancestor. It's kind of implied within Larryboy and the Bad Apple that Obadiah Bumbley is an ancestor of Larryboy, and that's where we can then just assume that this is actually canon. And so what we've got now is Obadiah Bumbley comes in and he utters his big line.
Today, we give thanks for our safe arrival on these beautiful and bountiful shores. Obadiah Bumbley.
So he comes in and he founds Bumbleberg, creates the city and whatever it starts off as. And within that time period, you then got Ephraim Appley, who is the ancestor of the Bad Apple that you then see in the actual show itself. He creates Appley's Funhouse. Appley's Funhouse was then a method of temptation that was used to distract the people from work so that way they can play a game of checkers, in which then there's that whole kind of shindig where he's like,
Oh, brother Obadiah, thou art so uptight. Prithee, let the brethren playeth a little checkers. Ephraim Appley.
and that whole shindig, yeah. And so then that becomes then a huge deal that then Obadiah Bumbley is dealing with, as well as the rest of the people of Bumbleberg. So Obadiah Bumbley comes in and says,
Thou hast tried to lead us into temptation, Brother Ephraim, but we shall not follow thee. Obadiah Bumbley.
and they banish Obadiah Bumbley from Bumbleberg because of his actions of trying to lead the people into temptation. This event here is a key point in the origin of Larryboy itself. And the reason for that is because Obadiah Bumbley here sees these events with Ephraim Apley. And he's like, okay, this just happened. And he thinks to himself, Apley's Funhouse is donezo. However, how unlikely is it that potentially another individual like Ephraim Apley could show up? Like, how possible is that? And I think Obadiah realizes that it's not nearly as much out of the realm of possibility as he would want to believe. It is not like, it's not, he definitely knows that Ephraim Apley won't be the only one. And so, what does Obadiah Bumbley do? He understands that there needs to be somebody who is going to keep the people of Bumbleberg safe, that they are going to be able to keep people safe from temptation, other issues, and enemies that are going to be coming in. They're in a brand new area, and protection is necessary. But he knows that he can't do it all himself. So he sends word back to England or to Europe, wherever they were at, and summons his friends from over there. The ones that he would get are, you see the descendants of the line of Archimedes, because that friendship is still there. That family bond is still there. So that descendant then comes over. You also get Lucas and Lewis from Duke and the Great Pie War and King George and the Ducky, Bob the Tomato, and he comes down. At least, like, what VeggieTales would use then as Bob the Tomato. I apologize. My webcam is going absolutely bonkers. I don't know how to keep it at a stable focus.
I can't do a Western this time. I can prepare. I need the Bible. Jingle, jingle, jingle. Look, it's the $10 hat. What do you mean? No. Jingle, jingle, jingle. Oh, man.
That's much better. Okay. So, Obadiah Bumbley then brings them over. And then he goes and he is like, okay, we're going to be budding a new nation here, which eventually will become the nation of America. And we're going to have enemies, not just from beyond our borders, but from within as well. And we need to be prepared for that. And so, Obadiah Bumbley here establishes the League of Incredible Vegetables in its early stage. It maybe wasn't necessarily called the League of Incredible Vegetables, but through the line of Archimedes, Lucas, and himself, they then designate themselves as being a secret organization to protect the nation of America from these dangers from within. He lets the external affairs go on to the military, but from the people within, that's what he does. Hence why then he becomes early superheroes. Okay, but Obadiah Bumbley continues to keep his interactions within the city of Bumbleberg. And probably even the descendant of Lucas stays in there. We're just going to call him Bob, because he's Bob the Tomato in the show, and that just is an easy way to recognize him. And same thing with Archibald, we're just going to keep it that way. So you got Bob, who probably sticks around as Bumbleberg being the first major city, sticks around there for a while. Archibald then sticks around there as well. They stick around for a while, and then eventually Bob moves off and starts another city. And whatever that city could be. I'm just going to say, because of the way it's been used in the show, and you've seen it happen in a few times, the city of Pugsleyville. We're just going to say Pugsleyville is the one that Bob goes off and starts on his own. And then Archibald and Obadiah Bumbley stick around, form Bumbleberg. Because he's a founding father of Bumbleberg, he's able to then get extremely wealthy from that and be able to make a lot of money being the leader of the city for years and years and years and years and years. And then throughout this instance, he then continues to keep the line of people set up going for 300 years. The descendants of Obadiah Bumbley, that line continues for, I guess I won't say quite 300 years, because we're going to be getting into the modern times at about 200 something ish years, like 290. Actually, we'll just go 300 because it was the tricentennial celebration of Bumbleberg. We'll just go with that. For 300 years, from the founding of Bumbleberg to then the present day, that line continues on, and eventually, as technology develops and stuff, that secret organization goes from like a secret agent kind of thing to then realizing that being like a secret agent intelligence kind of thing wasn't enough, to which then they become the League of Incredible Vegetables as we know them today. And throughout that time period, some descendant, once the technology would advance, would create then the first ever Larryboy. Larryboy is established in this instance. Thingamabob gets established in this instance. And throughout this 300 years, you then also get developing as more relationships happen. You get the heroes of Escape and Vogue. They also all show up. And that all then puts it together of, boom, this all happens. And the League of Incredible Vegetables becomes formed. The Larry Cave gets built. The relationship between Larryboy and the city of Bumbleberg gets established throughout this 300 years, and that then leads things like the Larry signal to be put up, because the Larry signal is going to be a thing that's going to be necessary in order to call Larryboy whenever they need those issues. That kind of whole thing gets set up, and we'll get into more things because you probably have other questions like what about the Bumbleberg Community College with the superhero class and stuff like that. That actually will get talked about later on as we get deeper on into the modern era.
So what the world needs now is a hero, one who's kind and true and brave and bold.
So we're fast forwarding about 200 and something years, basically just under 300 years, to the time where Larry showed that he was worthy to take up the mantle of Larryboy. So we know that Larry's father is an astronaut, and that is something that he picks up after he retires the mantle of Larryboy. But before he was able to retire the mantle of Larryboy, he had to decide which one of his 4 sons, Bob, Steve, Mark, Larry, were going to be the next Larryboy. During this time, the family was living in the city of Bumbleberg, and throughout their time living there, they often would go and visit their good friend Junior Asparagus, who lived in the small town of Dingletown. Now, you're probably wondering where this all fits in. It comes in a wonderful film, The Toy That Saved Christmas. This is where Larry proves that he is worthy of picking up the mantle of Larryboy. Let's say at this point, Larry is kind of like is really young, kind of like I'd say 16 to 17 years old, maybe even younger than that, when he meets Buzzsaw Louie with Bob and Junior. They sneak back into Mr. Nezer's factory and share the good news of Christmas, as we would see in the episode. But I think there was more going on here. So what we know is that everybody wanted the Buzzsaw Louie toy. And so Mr. Nezer sets it up to have everybody want to get a Buzzsaw Louie. But there was secretly something else going on, because why else would you create a toy with a fully functioning buzzsaw? And so what happens is Mr. Nezer creates Buzzsaw Louie with this artificial intelligence that was programmed to, when a certain number of Buzzsaw Louies were distributed, were going to be activated, thus creating this like robot army for Mr. Nezer to take over the world. Except for that one Buzzsaw Louie that warns them of what happens. And so in the show, you see them sneak into the factory to tell the people the good news of Christmas. But in the actual events, they sneak in to warn them about the incoming Buzzsaw Louie invasion. And thus then they thwart it by destroying all the other Buzzsaw Louies. Mr. Nezer gets arrested, his factory gets shut down, all that kind of stuff. Okay. And Larry's dad sees that and notices that Larry went above and beyond what he was required to do. He sacrificed a lot. Without any training or anything like that, he was willing to sacrifice himself, his freedom, his life, in order to save the world from the impending Buzzsaw Louie invasion. And that stuck out to him. That made him realize that Larry was different than his 3 other brothers. And so, Larry's dad pulls him aside and talks to him about it, tells him about the mantle of Larryboy, tells him about it, and tells him that he is worthy to take it up. And thus he begins training. He trains over and over and over and over and over before he's ready. And then eventually when it becomes time Larry then takes up the mantle of Larryboy, and his father becomes an astronaut. And at this point, you're probably wondering how this all makes sense. But how this works out is when you get to specifically the first major supervillain in the VeggieTales series, Larryboy and the Fib from Outer Space. By that point, they already have an established relationship with Larryboy. They have the Larry signal. They have this whole alerting Larryboy system in case there's an impending alien invasion, all that kind of stuff. And so, by the time Larry gets ready to deal with the Fib from Outer Space, he just has to see the signal, spring into action, and he's good. And in the same instance that this happens with Larry, Larry the Cucumber, their family decide to keep an eye on the Asparagus family. They do that because then later on throughout Larry's career, Junior gets adopted into the League of Incredible Vegetables under the name Ricochet. And the reason why that this is important that they started looking at him back then is because Junior is like super young by the time he becomes Ricochet. He's like maybe 7 or 8 years old. So I think that actually in Dingletown, you're actually looking at Dad Asparagus, and Larry, Bob, and Dad Asparagus have this really buddy buddy connection with all this. Dad Asparagus being the oldest, and then they all grow up, and Larry explains what's going on when Junior becomes Ricochet. Because Dad Asparagus initially turns down the role of Ricochet, but then Larry knows that they need him, and thus he gets adopted in as Ricochet. Thus then Bob, who lives out in Pugsleyville, becomes Thingamabob. And throughout this period of time, between Larryboy and the Fib from Outer Space and the League of Incredible Vegetables, there are more people getting adopted into the League through like Vogue and Escape. They get moved in as more family relations get picked up, and eventually then that stems on to more and more stuff like that, if that makes sense. Until eventually you get what we then have as the League of Incredible Vegetables. And it all starts from when Larry gets the mantle. And then you're probably also wondering, okay, but what about the cartoon adventures of Larryboy? Where does that all fit in? So as we know, in Larryboy and the Fib from Outer Space, which is here at the beginning of the timeline. Not at the beginning of the timeline, but Larryboy and the Fib from Outer Space is the first supervillain that Larry the Cucumber deals with. And in that, you know that Alfred creates he puts in the plane, all the different modes of the Larry mobile. And you know that in the cartoon adventures of Larryboy, those are already in. And also, it wouldn't make sense for Larry to then become Larryboy, working in the show business in VeggieTales to help maintain his cover, and then suddenly become a janitor at the Daily Bumble. None of that makes sense. But as we know, is throughout time, shows come and go. So with that going in, you then have eventually Larry the Cucumber and Bob the Tomato retire VeggieTales. And around the same time, because they're old, all that kind of stuff. And around the same time, Larry retires the mantle of Larryboy to then his son. Alfred then has a son named Archie. And this is where you get to where the cartoon adventures of Larryboy actually are. They take place following the adventures of the son of the Larry the Cucumber that we know. And so then Bob, with his money and everything, his son then starts the Daily Bumble and becomes chief editor. And then Larry's son only becomes janitor to kind of do this like family favor kind of thingamajigger, but doesn't actually take up the mantle of Thingamabob. And so he doesn't know that Larry's son would then take up the mantle of Larryboy passed on from his father. And this even makes more sense because as the more technology builds and builds and builds, you then get the utility belt and the cape and all of that Larry uses in the cartoon adventures of Larryboy that does not get used in the other episodes. Thus, that completes the timeline of Larryboy. Hey guys, Zojolix here, just wanting to give a quick thank you so much for watching this whole monster of a video and the compilation of putting the entire Larryboy theory together. I hope you guys really enjoyed it. If you have any questions, there will be a link to our Discord in the description below. You can take a look at that and ask any questions, see if there's any areas that maybe you can find a hole in there or something. Would really like to see what you guys think. Please go ahead and check it out. Give it a like. comment on it if you have any other theories or anything like that that you would like to see. I would really appreciate it. And thank you guys again so much for watching. We really appreciate it. And I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your day. And we will see you all next time on the Countertop.
Dance with me, Lampy!